Today's video is going to focus on classifying organisms and then the characteristics of the different kingdoms that organisms can be placed into. So let's look first at what a dichotomous key is. And you may have worked with these before in previous classes. So a dichotomous key is essentially a tool that you're going to use to classify organisms by putting them in various categories. And usually it's a yes or no kind of situation. Like if we look at this particular example, we start with, right, fur or no fur, and we go from there. Now, if they were no fur, now we keep going. No feathers, feathers. Right? And so we keep putting them into these opposing categories until we can narrow down exactly what the organism is. Dichotomous keys can look slightly different, so we'll look at a variety of these so that you're comfortable using them. So when you're using your dichotomous key, you always start at the beginning. Okay? Always, 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 no matter what. So for example, let's say you had 3 leaves here. Let's say we had leaf 1, leaf 2, leaf 3. So let's have just like a long skinny leaf here. And then let's have a kind of spiky, different looking leaf here. Okay, so when you classify these leaves, you start at the beginning for each one. So for example, leaf 1, we start right here at whether it's a compound leaf or a simple leaf. And then we go from there. And then when we're ready to do leaf 2, we go back up to the top and start with number 1. Is it a compound leaf or a simple leaf? Because like number 2 says there, that you can be tricked. For example, you'll see leaf rounded and pointed at the tip. You're going to see that 2 times. And so it's important you went to the right set of those, whether it was a simple leaf or a compound leaf. And so to get the appropriate classification. So always start at the very top at number 1. Okay, some common vocabulary that you may see as part of your dichotomous key. We want to be sure you're comfortable with this terminology. So let's start easy, right, with stuff that you probably already know. We're going to start over here on the right with vertebrate versus invertebrate. Hopefully we know that a vertebrate has a backbone or a spine, where an invertebrate has no backbone or spine. Okay, eukaryote versus prokaryote. This should be review for you guys, right? So membrane-bound organelles for the eukaryote. No membrane-bound organelles for the prokaryote, right? That's our bacteria with no membrane-bound organelles. Hopefully also heterotroph and autotroph you're comfortable with that terminology, right? Autotroph is self. So a heterotroph needs to consume their food. You can see examples of that over here on the right, where an autotroph is self-feeding. So it makes its own food. And we're going to look at some different ways that organisms can do that. Photosynthesis is not the only way that they can do that. Okay, so now when we come back over to the left, we've got 2 types of symmetry. Radial versus bilateral. So remember, bi means 2. So the fly here is an example of bilateral symmetry. So 2, when you go right down the middle, it's going to divide it into 2 symmetrical halves. Where radial symmetry, like spokes of a wheel, when you radiate out from the center, you get symmetry. But if you go right down the middle, you don't necessarily get symmetry. So bilateral symmetry, I can divide it right down the middle and I get 2 symmetrical halves. Radial symmetry, if I radiate out like spokes of a wheel, I can get symmetry that way. Segmented versus unsegmented, kind of how its name implies, right? The body of the organism is divided into segments, like you can see on the worm on the left, versus no segments like the worm on the right, how there's no divisions of the various body sections. An insect would be segmented, right, where it has the 3 major segments. Okay, and then when you're looking at dichotomous keys for plants, a lot of times you'll see compound versus simple leaves. Okay, that's going to refer to, if you look at almost what looks like the stem coming right up the middle of the leaf, if there is 1 leaflet coming off of it, versus multiples, that's your simple versus compound. So a simple leaf is essentially one big leaf, where a compound leaf would have multiple little leaflets coming off of what looks like essentially a bunch of leaves together, making up one clump of leaves. Okay, you may also see your various groupings of organisms displayed using what's called a cladogram. We'll look more and work with cladograms when we get into evolution, but these are going to show evolutionary relationships and common ancestry. And that is essentially one of the ways that things can be classified. And so you may see some diagrams like this. And like I said, we'll look much closer at these when we get to evolution. Okay, so taxonomy is going to be the actual science of defining groups of organisms based on their characteristics. Okay, so we can classify the organisms into these that actually doing, and taxonomy is the science of defining the groups and these shared characteristics. Okay, you are going to need to memorize this essentially ranking of groups. Okay, domain is the largest, and so it is the least specific, meaning that this is the broadest, widest category, where species is going to be the most specific and relate to one organism only, and that is it. So essentially you're looking at largest to smallest. So you're going to need to memorize this: domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Okay, a mnemonic to help you with that: did King Philip come over from Germany safely? And there's lots of different ones of these. There's one about grape soda and good spaghetti. Doesn't matter which one you use. We just need you to make sure you have them in order. Did King Philip come over from Germany safely? Domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. You're going to be asked questions like which one is the most specific, or who's the most related, and maybe it will give you a chart and give you information about kingdom, phylum, class, and order. And you have to realize that the ones that share the most stuff, like the kingdom, the phylum, the class, order, they're the most related to one another. Okay. We use this system because common names can be very confusing. They can be misleading, like, for example, a starfish, not really a fish. Okay. A dragonfly, not a dragon, right? They can be confusing. For example, I can have multiple names: blue jay, blue coat, corn thief, puma, mountain lion, cougar. They're all the same thing, right? So it can be confusing to use those common names because you could think you're talking about two different organisms, where in reality you're talking about the same thing. So it really helps when we use these scientific names for organisms to cut down on that confusion, because there's only going to be one scientific name for every organism. So when you form the scientific name, it's a two-word name, like a first and a last name. And the first one is their genus, and the second one is their species. So you could be, example, given a list of organisms and be given a list of their names. And the ones that have the same genus name, or the same genus and species name, they would be the most closely related, right? So for example, this bird, this blue jay here, this is the genus, Cyanocita, right? Cyano is blue. Cristata is the species. And so that will knock out that confusion. So that's how you form those scientific names. Genus and species, very specific. The scientific name for humans is Homo sapiens. Remember, Homo means man, right? Man are the same. It means wise man. Okay, so Linnaeus is kind of who developed this system, right? This domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Remember, you've got to memorize that. You can see how this coyote and this gray wolf are classified here. They're in the same domain. They have the same kingdom, Animalia. They're chordates, which means they have a backbone. They're class mammals. They're order carnivore. They're in the canine family, in the Canis genus, but then you'll see their species name is different. So these two organisms are very closely related. Okay, so let's look at the different characteristics of the various kingdoms. So we're going to start with the domains. We're only going to look at domains and kingdoms. We're not going to look at different characteristics of phylum, class, order, family, that kind of thing. Okay, there are 3 domains. There's a eukarya domain, okay, which it says right, it got cut off here. To be in the domain eukarya, you must have eukaryotic cells. So you must have membrane-bound organelles. So eubacteria and the archaea, these are both prokaryotic domains. So let's look at the various kingdoms. This is a chunk of information that you're just going to have to memorize. So if you're a flashcard maker, you might need to make some flashcards. You might need to spend a few minutes every night with this to help memorize this stuff. We'll do some mnemonics in class and we'll practice with it in class to help it sink in, but you're going to have to just sit down and get these characteristics down so that you can then apply them and do comparisons. There's a lot of comparing the 2 kingdoms in this multiple kingdoms together in this unit. So let's start with the Archaebacteria kingdom. So this is in the archaea domain. They are prokaryotic, so they have no membrane-bound organelles. So this is a bacterial kingdom. These organisms are unicellular, so that means organization-wise. Remember our organization of cell, tissue, organ system, organism. So organizational level here is only going to be at the cell. Can't be any more than that because they're unicellular. So I can't have groups of cells working together, that kind of thing. Some of these have a cell wall, some don't. So, a description of whether it has a cell wall or not may not necessarily narrow it down for you. You've also got a mix of other characteristics. You've got bacteria in this kingdom that are heterotrophs that need to consume or take food in. You've got a chunk of bacteria in this kingdom that can make their own food. Most of the ones that can make their own food are what are called chemosynthetic autotrophs. We've already talked about photosynthesis, right? Where we take that light energy and convert it into chemical or food energy. This is taking inorganic compounds like sulfur compounds, hydrogen compounds, and converting that into organic compounds, converting that into food. So a little bit different, not necessarily doing photosynthesis to create their own food. They can use essentially chemicals and rearrange those chemicals into organic compounds for their food. Some of them reproduce asexually through binary fission. Some of them will reproduce sexually and get a little bit more variation within their DNA. You have both bacteria that are able to move here and some that are not. One of the key things about this bacterial kingdom that makes it stand out is that they live in extreme environments, as in places you and I cannot live. So some examples that we have here are methanogens. They live in places where there's lots of methane gas, which we can't handle. You have halophiles that live in places where there's lots of salt. Again, we can't handle that. Thermophiles, so in places of extreme temperature, extreme pressure, places that don't have any oxygen. These are what we mean by extreme environments. Also meaning these bacteria are not the bacteria that get us sick because they don't live in the same places that we do. Okay, our next bacterial kingdom is the eubacterial kingdom. Okay, they're in the bacteria domain, also prokaryotic as well as unicellular, which means organization-wise, again, the best we can have is cellular organization. There can't go up to a tissue here. Some of these will have a cell wall, and that cell wall will be made of peptidoglycan. That's a unique compound for a cell wall that you would only see in this eubacteria kingdom. Again, we have both heterotrophs and autotrophs. Some can be chemosynthetic. Some are photosynthetic. We already talked about what that means. Again, we've got things that can do, bacteria that can do asexual and sexual reproduction. So some that will do binary fission, some that will do genetic recombinations for sexual reproduction, some that are mobile. So they might have a flagellum or cilia that makes them more mobile. And some that are immobile, that don't go anywhere. These bacteria, these are the ones that live in or with us. Okay, so in this case, a reminder here, they're not all bad, right? We have our decomposers, which is a big deal. We need to get rid of the dead stuff. We have ones that help us make our food, right? Like, for instance, yogurt. We have some that help us maintain our gut health. But then we also have some of these that are what make us sick, right? That might give us a bacterial infection that we need antibiotics for. Okay, so these bacteria, though, these are the ones that live with us. Some are good, some are bad. Okay, you can see some examples of them over there on the right. A wide variety of shapes and kind of looks to these bacterium. Okay, now let's switch over to the eukarya domain. Every kingdom now is going to be part of this eukarya domain. So we're in the protist kingdom. So eukaryotic cells. So we've got membrane-bound organelles here, like a nucleus, endoplasmic reticulum, Golgi apparatus. Remember, ribosomes are not membrane-bound. All cells have ribosomes. Okay, most of these are unicellular. Some are multicellular. So if they're multicellular, they can be organized into tissues, right? Because tissues are groups of cells that are working together. Most of these do not have a cell wall. Again, I've got both for these categories down here, both heterotroph and autotroph, both kinds of reproduction, both mobile and immobile. This is a very broad kingdom. Essentially, you've got a lot of organisms in here that are kind of like plants, but not quite, kind of like fungus, but not quite, kind of like animals, but not quite. So we put them into this protist kingdom, this catch-all kingdom. It's actually a kingdom that's thinking about dissolving and moving them out to the other kingdoms. So a wide variety of examples. Some of the common ones that you'll see are a paramecium. This one is the paramecium right here. Okay, all those little cilia on it help it move. It's got a big contractile vacuole to help monitor its water. You've got an amoeba here, which is going to have pseudopodia, right? These fake feet that'll kind of reach out and grab things so they can eat and move. Okay, this one over here on the right with the flagellum there, that's a euglena. Okay, so again, you can see all eukaryotic cells. All of these do well in water, including there's a multicellular example of kelp. Seaweed is not a plant. Kelp is not a plant, even though it seems like it's a plant. Okay, it is a protist. Okay, so looking at the fungus kingdom, again, we're still in the eukarya domain, which means the cells have to be eukaryotic. They are multicellular, which means, again, I can organize at that tissue level because I have multiple cells here. The exception is yeast. Yeast is a fungus, and it is a unicellular organism. Exceptions to the rule are usually important to know, right? So fungus will have a cell wall. That cell wall will be made of chitin. It is not pronounced chitin. It is pronounced chitin. These are heterotrophs, and they're absorption heterotrophs, meaning that they break down the food outside of their body and then absorb the nutrients. And if you think about this, if you've seen something mold, right, or something rot, it gets softer and squishier. That's because that mold is releasing digestive enzymes to break down that food so it can then absorb the nutrients. If you think about it, a mushroom doesn't have a mouth. A mold doesn't have a mouth, but it is not an autotroph. It has to take in food somehow. So they're absorption heterotrophs. They do sexual reproduction. Most fungus produce spores to help with their reproduction. They are immobile. They do not move. Okay? These are decomposers. saprophytes, which is these absorption heterotrophs. They contain hyphae. Hyphae are these strands of tissues. You see it in mushrooms. If you look in this picture at the top here, you can see hyphae coming down from the mushroom into the soil. If you think about the gills on a mushroom cap, like if you turn a mushroom cap over and you see those like kind of stripes, those are the hyphae impacted close together. On this microscope picture over here, you can see hyphae. So these are these strands of cells. We already mentioned that the fungus kingdom also produces these spores for reproduction. Examples here are definitely mushrooms, molds. A lot of times you just see wide varieties of examples of different molds and mushrooms in this particular kingdom. So when you're going through these kingdoms, I know it's been a lot so far. Okay, keep those things down. Is it eukaryotic, multicellular, unicellular? How does it get its food? And then remember some of these things that are unique to these particular kingdoms, like the hyphae, the spores, the chitin for the fungus kingdom. Okay, we have two kingdoms left. So we have plant and animal. So the plantae kingdom, again, eukaryotic domain, eukaryotic cells. Plants are multicellular and they're much more complex than a lot of people think. They go all the way up to the organ system, like an animal would. These have tissues. Their cells are grouped into tissues. Their tissues are grouped into organs, and those organs are then grouped into systems. Plants will have a cell wall made of cellulose. So remember, that's a carbohydrate. It's a polymer that we've talked about before. They're autotrophs. They do photosynthesis. So they're using that light energy to convert it into chemical energy. They do sexual reproduction. Okay? That's why plants produce pollen. That's all part of the sexual reproduction of a plant, and we'll talk more about plants next unit. They are immobile or sessile. Sessile is another term for immobile or stationary. You see all of these different terms, so we'll make sure we're comfortable with that. Examples would be like angiosperms, which are flowering plants. Gymnosperms, which are like pine trees. They produce cones, no flowers. Ferns, you can see a wide variety of examples over here on this diagram to the right. There's angiosperms, there's gymnosperms, there's mosses, there's ferns. All of those are different types of plants. Okay, so eukaryotic organs, cellulose, photosynthesis, sessile, sexual reproduction, those are all characteristics of plants. Okay, and finally we have the animal kingdom, which again is the eukarya domain. So eukaryotic cells, multicellular, organized up to the organ system. This is where we fall in, right? We fall under the category of mammals. Okay, no cell wall, heterotrophs, but ingestion heterotrophs, meaning that the food is digested inside the body. So we eat the food. So animals have to have a mouth, right? They eat the food and then break the food down inside the body, unlike the fungus that broke it down outside of the body, then absorbed the nutrients. And organisms in the animal kingdom do sexual reproduction. They are mobile. Okay, we've had a lot of things that can't move so far, but animals are mobile. They're able to move. Wide variety here. Just a few examples listed: sponges, insects, mammals, birds, reptiles. You've also got fish, amphibians, arachnids, crustaceans, different kinds of worms, and echinoderms. You are not going to need to memorize every single different possible animal. Okay? The one that trips people up the most, though, is when they throw a sponge on there, a marine mammal, a sponge, coral. Those things actually are animals. They are not plants. They're not protists. They're not rocks. They're actually alive, and they are animals. Okay, so I know that was a lot of information thrown at you at one time. Like I said, we'll do mnemonics in class to help you memorize these. We'll do a lot of stations and working with these to help apply these characteristics. but you are going to need to sit down and spend some time memorizing these. Mark your questions so that we can clear anything up so that when you come in and you move to your stations, you know what's happening and you're comfortable with that material.